Welcome to Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast, where we meet experts from all walks of life to learn their intrinsic motivation so that they can share it with the world. What do we have in store today? Stay tuned to find out more. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody out there in podcast land. This is Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. I am Hamza.
And I am David.
And I'm really interested in our podcast today. We're speaking with Robert Toporek. He has a new book of baby and child massage. And I'm really interested in learning more about dealing with children or at a young age giving them massage. As an aside, my personal experience being born in New Jersey, being born in Philadelphia, growing up in New Jersey, when I moved to Florida, it seemed like with the Latin community, they were more touchy-feely. They had a closer personal space than we did in the Northeast. And I'm wondering if Robert can kind of point us in the right direction. I'm sure he will. But I'm thinking that they had more human contact, or the culture was just different. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Robert Toporek to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Robert.
Well, thank you. What can I say about this so touchy-feely thing? We're in a pretty precarious position in our culture at the moment with all of the allegations of sexual abuse and stuff like that. And so people are going to become hypersensitive to the idea of touch and appropriate touch and inappropriate touch. So my book, Hands-On Parenting, A Practical Guide to Massage for Happier, Healthier, Smarter Kids, I think that the point of it is that very few parents that I've met, and I've met many parents, actually use touch as one of the significant methods of raising their babies or children. And there's such a vast lack of knowledge about the absence of it, and that's primarily because so many people in charge have never had a massage. Oh. I am profoundly shocked at how many people I've met that have never had a massage. Hopefully this book will help turn the tide.
Absolutely, and I will go publicly on record and say that I almost proposed a couple of times. So I know that there's a huge gap in my life when I do not get a massage, and I know it's time to do so. But since you're dealing with so many parents, let me ask you from a child perspective or what you've seen. There has been some preliminary research, I'm sure you can dive deeper into this, that when that child's first born, those minutes are so critical that they have to feel that mother's touch. And if they don't, they're already set off on a wrong tangent. What's your take on that?
My take is the problem with what you just said. And you said a mother's touch. And very seldom do we ever talk about a father's touch. Mm. So when my son was born, I'm actually a advanced certified Rolf practitioner. I studied directly with Dr. Rolf the last 4 years of her life, and I've pioneered Rolfing babies and children. And in the back of my mind was always, I've Rolfed a number of babies like 5 weeks old, 6 weeks old, but never a newborn, and it was always in the back of my mind that the best time would be to begin in the beginning. And the first half an hour that my son was born, while they were stitching up his mother, I got to touch my baby. I got to hold him, and I gave him his first Rolfing session. And I have been a hands-on father for a long time. Actually, my original book, I wanted to call it Massage for Babies and Children for Fathers, because fathers oftentimes don't have the emotional wherewithal. They are out working hard, construction workers, whatever, or people who are using their brain, but they don't come and back home and connect with their feelings, and they aren't in touch with their children's feelings or their own feelings. So I think it's just equally as important for a father's touch as it is for a mother's touch, and I think it's critical in that first few moments, because that baby's been in the womb for a few months, everything was all taken care of, we think we come out of the womb and we say, voila, I'm free, but we don't. We say, oh, my God, I got to survive. And there's no more safety net. And the best safety net for a newborn baby is either a mother's touch or a father's touch.
I agree.
Now, since it is, we talked a little bit offline about, the little jab. Since you do live in Philadelphia, go Eagles, and, hopefully they will pull it out for the rest of the year. But I bring that up because when you think of sports or you think of someone winning some type of accolades, championships, the first thing they say is, thanks, Mom, or hi, Mom, love you, Mom. And, the father's a distant second if you hear about them at all. And could you make the connection that because they weren't getting that emotional connection with their father via touch at the beginning, that it kind of exacerbates the situation?
A lot of professional athletes, well, that's one. That's for sure. And it goes back to what I was saying before, is that we don't actually train fathers to be fathers. Now, my son's mother unfortunately died when he was 10, and I started taking him to school every morning, and in elementary school. And after a few days, I noticed that when the women came out, they started talking to each other. They did not talk to me. And I said, oh, my God, there's a women's club. And it kind of like got profoundly, I got profoundly related to the fact that there's a women's club. When women get together, what they talk about is their children and their cooking and their, what they're doing and how they're nurturing their children. And what fathers get together and do is talk about work or talk about sports or something like that. So we need to have a whole change in the culture between mothers and fathers. And mothers have to understand that fathers are critical and critically important. I deal with I run a nonprofit program where we distribute computers to people that can't afford to buy new ones, about 15,000 of them so far. And 85% of those computers went to women raising children alone without the input of their fathers. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I'm going to do everything I can to empower fathers to read this book and to get in touch with themselves and get in touch with their children, and then have a conversation with their wives and their children about the importance of touch, safe touch, and one of the best things about the whole thing is if you do this with your children early, they'll grow up giving you massages.
Well, I mean, this is intrinsic motivation from a homie's perspective. So there's 3 guys on here talking about massage. Before you go into the benefits of talking about giving your children or babies a massage, what are some of the stigmas that we as men face as far as, like you first started out, touchy-feely? So, what are the preconceived notions of even venturing into this topic of conversation?
Well, I'm also a member of a minority journalist group of journalists. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I know about in minority communities, especially low-income minority communities, mm-hmm. there's a tremendous amount of incest happening on the planet that does not get reported, that does not get dealt with. I have a good friend who I met recently, and he's a father, and he was incarcerated for a number of years, got out and has turned his life around. And while he was incarcerated, his daughter was living with his wife and her boyfriend abused his daughter. And now she's suffering from severe mental issues. So there's a lot of things that happen to people that stay hidden. I have. If you read the book, I talk about some of those things for myself. My mother was not giving me massages to raise me. She was giving me not spankings, but literal beatings. And so when you bring up the idea of touch in a world in which touch is absent, the first thing people are going to do is look at you like you're weird, like you're from Mars. And especially, it's not every day that a 70-year-old white Vietnam veteran writes a book about massage and early childhood development. But I was waiting for somebody else to do it, but they didn't, so I get to be the one. And, somehow I'm going to use my sense of humor to promote the idea, and hopefully, because I am somebody who's profoundly related to that idea, and I have an incredible experience and background and foundation to support what I'm talking about, people will listen. And they are starting to.
Mm-hmm. We like to talk about perception a lot on the podcast, and, everyone has their own perception of everything. And I wanted to get your take, like you said, for this subject matter. If we just read Hands-On Parenting, a practical guide to massage for happier, healthier, smarter kids, and there's a beautiful baby on the cover, by the way, which is great. But I guess the general perception would be that a woman would be the author of that. What type of feedback or thought process were you thinking about when you wrote the book as to doing it on your own versus partnering with a female counterpart?
Unfortunately, I'm not that smart. I wrote the book not because I'm a great author or because I came up with the idea, but I was start a project in one of the worst drug neighborhoods of the world, where I took my Rolfing table and my massage table out to a neighborhood where there were more drug dealers and drug addicts walking around the streets in Philadelphia than there were people that were living there. And if you're from Philadelphia, you might know what I'm talking about by North Philadelphia. And I set up my table and I said, hey, who wants a Rolfing session? Who wants a massage? I had a little sign of posture. And one kid got up on the table and she worked on it for about half an hour with her clothes on, nice and safe. Her father was there. And she got up. How do you feel? And she felt good. And the next kid got up, and we kept doing that for a while. And a friend of mine owned a book publishing company, Running Press, and he came to me one day and said, can you write, what do you think about writing a book on massage for babies and children? I said, sounds like a good idea to me. And he came back a couple of weeks later, says, well, can you write it? And not knowing that I couldn't, I said I could. So they actually paid me to write that book, and it was called The New Book of Baby and Child Massage. The reason I wrote this book is because that book didn't have a lot of the things that I wanted in it, and references to Rolfing and Dr. Rolf and early childhood development. And so I got the rights back from the publisher. So I haven't thought twice about partnering with a woman in writing it, and I don't feel bad about it. I think that I'm kind of good at being a pioneer, and I think that more men have to get involved in this conversation, and more women have to respect that idea from their men. Not only respect that idea, but expect it from their men, that they are a hands-on parent. And I don't mean just, coming home and sitting down and playing games. I mean, literally knowing something about their children, knowing something about their brains, knowing something about the importance of neurological development. And I put tons of simple, common sense tips in the book that are not common practice, but if somebody just did a few of those things, it would fundamentally change how they raise their babies or children.
Mm-hmm.
Robert, you mentioned a little earlier that you have been trained in Rolfing or certified. For those that don't know what Rolfing is, can you talk about that or explain what that is?
Well, my definition is a little bit different than the traditional Rolfer because I studied directly with Dr. Rolf, and she planted a couple seeds in my brain that the other Rolfers haven't picked up on that memo yet. But my view of it is, from the moment we're conceived, we are in a ball in a womb, and that's called flexors, muscles that contract overpower muscles that extend. And the theory is that when we come out of the womb, we're perfectly straight and everything's groovy. This is just talking about a normal baby. There's lots of babies that aren't born like that. And I happen to have met the guy who discovered the link between human beings and apes. And if you think about verticality, or, if you get involved in that evolutionary conversation, and you look at the picture, what you're looking at is the evolution of people standing up straight, or called the evolution of verticality. So Dr. Rolf's idea was that we could enhance a person's body's relationship to gravity by freeing their body from patterns of tension that they've either inherited or they've accumulated through the trials and tribulations of life. I'll give you one example. I was a pretty raucous kid. I quit high school, joined the Army, went to Vietnam, spent 2 years there, came back, and nobody said, how you feeling or anything you want to communicate. So half of my squad got killed or wounded, so I held all of that stuff in. And my very first massage in Big Sur, California, the woman picked up my arm and kept saying, let go, and I said, I am. And she kept wiggling my arm, and finally it let go, and I understood the distinction, tension, like as an experience, and it was the first time I'd ever let go. So there's a lot that goes on in people's lives, falling off of roofs, falling off of bikes, all of that stuff that we think we've recovered from, but we've really just buried in our bodies. So Rolfing both addresses the stuff that happened to us as well as what was there before we were ever born. And if you look in certain, I discovered this with working on brain injury kids. I would look at the kid and I'd look at the parent, I'd see the same postural pattern. Mm-hmm. And so we inherit patterns of posture from our parents, our families, our culture. We inherit behaviors that turn into postures, or you could say patterns of tension. Japanese people are a little bit more constrained than, say, somebody in California. So all of that, if you really study people's bodies are really a study in behavior. And so by working with their bodies and working with their minds, you can begin to alter those patterns. People stand up straighter, they feel better, chronic aches and pains go away, they have more confidence and they're more self-expressed, are some of the results that I produce.
Okay.
And some of that can be prevented by doing massage at an early age.
So pretty much right from the get-go, you're talking about doing massage like day one?
Hour one.
Hour one. Sounds good. I'm in.
Yeah, I knew the difference between actually going to a professional versus going to a girlfriend per se. You know, she's not going to probably rub you for 60 minutes or 80 to 90 minutes.
No,
or if she does, you're going to have you. Yeah, right. You're not going to. And then if she does, then you have to do it for 80 or 90 minutes, and
Exactly.
Someone's going to get upset. I do want to back up for a second because you mentioned a lot about posture and burying things that you bury in the body from the experience and repeated patterns. And I don't want to gloss over what you had mentioned earlier about in different neighborhoods based off of income that incest not being reported. And I know there was a big thing in the since this was a homie's perspective, in the hip-hop community about a year ago, there was a pillar of the hip-hop community, and, one of his fans or somebody that was under him had come out like 30 years later and said that he was being molested and all this. And so there was this argument over statute of limitations to actually go after someone that has physically abused someone. So what's your take on, one, the statute of limitations, and then two, changing that cycle? Because if you're a little boy or girl and this happens to you, you're probably displaying some of those characteristics while you're in school in a public place, and you're pretty much not saying that you're doomed from the start, but there's characteristics that maybe others don't know what to look out for.
Well, this is a little personal story of my own. When I was younger, I don't even remember how old I was, but my brother, I could never prove that he was gay. Back in those days, you didn't even talk about it. But he would get in bed with me and hump me. Did it like 2 or 3 times. The third time, it was like really serious. I got really freaked out. I kicked him out of the bed. I went in my closet, and it was a big walk-in closet, and I remember closing the door and just hiding in there for a while. And I never told anybody about it. I never told my parents, and I began to act that out in ways that were not all that healthy. In my next book that I'm going to write about, called Healing the Wounds of War, there's stuff that happened in Vietnam that nobody ever talks about that I'll be able to talk about in that book. And we have just totally glossed over it as a country, as a nation, as a culture, and including what happened in Vietnam. So I don't know about the legal aspect of it, but I know that I've rolfed a couple of women who have spent years of being abused. And for them, it's not a lot, but I've always known, and I say that the best thing for someone who's experienced abuse is to find somebody like me who's a accomplished practitioner of touch, to be able to work with their bodies, to have them release that fear or whatever it is they're holding in from that incident that are holding them down and holding them back and ruining their lives. I've done that a couple of times. It's made a huge difference. But there are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of women all over this country where that goes on. And if you go into a low-income neighborhood, a woman cannot walk around without being sexually harassed. Just guys on the street, hey, babe, come here, I want that. So it's pretty, same thing in schools. So I don't know the answer to it other than, hopefully, before I'm dead, this whole revolution of parents being in touch with their children, talking to them about touch, having them experience safe touch, healthy touch, will empower those kids to stand up for themselves and say, cut it out or report the person or do whatever they need to do so that it gets nipped in the bud.
As you were talking, I was thinking about, in the news in the past couple of years, a generation ago, I remember in kindergarten or first grade, oh, that's his girlfriend, that's so cute, right? But in this decade, those kids are getting suspended if they're, he gave her an innocent kiss. That's harassment.
I know. As I told you, I grew up in the 60s, where life was a little bit different than it is now. And I don't know what direction this country is going to go in. My best hope is that the problem starts at home and it can end at home. And hopefully with my book, Hands-On Parenting, parents can begin to take a different approach to raising their children. I know in my nonprofit organization where we distribute computers so people can't afford to buy new ones, we have a bunch of people that come there to volunteer. They're great at fixing computers. A number of them don't have the best posture in the world, and they're not interested in me giving them a session for free. During the summertime, we have a bunch of teens. They come in, and some of them you can barely understand what they're saying because they don't have the capacity to express themselves. And that started at home. Now, they're really smart. They're going to go to MIT, and they're probably going to invent something really critical, but it's not necessarily going to move the meter on the growth and development of humanity. And I think that we need to do whatever we can as quickly as possible to create more peace on the planet and less violence. A lot of kids who grow up in violence, it literally affects their brain. And what I discovered in writing this book and exploring the subject is that nurturing is one of the least expensive, easiest way of growing positive brain cells. Do you know that?
No, I didn't.
Really? No. Nurturing. Yeah. Nurturing. All you need to do is nurture people.
Yeah.
And I had some people come into my office yesterday to get computers. One was a little Hispanic girl. Her mother doesn't speak English. And that affects the mother's behavior. So she's always afraid to say something because she's not sure she's saying the right thing. And then there was a 13-year-old girl and her 7-year-old sister. And hopefully just by being with me yesterday, we made a difference. Everybody we distribute a computer to now, we also give them a copy of my book.
Oh, cool.
It is.
So let me ask you, usually I'm a big fan of reflexology. So if I'm looking for a massage or specifically for reflexology, I would do a Google search and find what I want, and then, the transaction would happen. What is the difference between a traditional deep tissue massage and Rolfing?
The difference between the Eagles and the Giants?
There you go.
One's a losing team and one's a winning team. So, yep. Ask me that question. I've had. Well, I'm spoiled because I had Dr. Rolf work on my body. I studied for 3 years with her son, who helped her develop Rolfing, and he worked on my body. And the difference between them and anybody else I've ever had is the difference between day and night. Day and night's not even the right expression. And I've had lots of different Rolfers. I've had hundreds of different massages. And recently I have a pain in my neck I'm trying to get rid of. And I went to a bunch of different people. I mentioned it to somebody, and they said, oh, I've got the perfect person. And I went to her last Thursday, and it was the touch I've been looking for a long time. So not every, and I was thinking about this because I don't really have a degree in, I've never taken a course in massage. I've Rolfed 4,500 people. That might account for some credential. I don't really have a background or any training in early childhood development, but my son could read 1,000 words by the time he was 1, count to 100 in English and Spanish. And it's just a function of finding, and just taking, intellectual knowledge will not teach you how to have the right touch. And you can learn all the nerves and all the bones and all the muscles and all that other stuff and still not have the right touch. And I don't know yet, because I haven't taught anybody how to have the right touch, but part of it has to do with being connected to yourself, your heart, and your brain. Like, you got to know what you're doing. You got to be connected to your heart. And not every person that I've had work on my body is all that connected to all three things at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And then the difference between that and Rolfing, massage is, Rolfing's not a massage, by the way. And it's a program of personal transformation. And it has a beginning, it has an end, it has 3 parts to it. And Dr. Rolf had a recipe. If you study the recipe and you follow the recipe, you produce the results. And a lot of people have picked up on deep tissue massage. That's called the technique. A lot of people have picked up on something called structural integration. Some of them are good. Some of them, I don't know. I'd give you 2 cents for them. And there's some offers I wouldn't give you 2 cents for. But I'm going to have to change that, because I'm going to publish everything I can about Rolfing babies, children, and families. I'm going to publish everything I can about massage for babies and children. And we're going to start producing videos, and whatever I can do to train other people on what to do and how to do it is what I'm going to do.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I have another question for you that you might not have asked.
Okay.
How do you keep a baby still?
Yeah, good question.
That's a good question, right? Depends on what age they are. If it's in the very beginning, it's not a problem, because they're not sitting up, they're not rolling over, they're not moving around. You can pretty much do whatever you want. And but if they're like beyond a year old, and I'm working on them, a year old, 2 years, 3 years, what I do is we have something called cell phones. We have something called video games or video learning programs. or video music programs or something like that. You give a kid a video cell phone, and they'll just sit there and watch it. And then they'll let you do whatever you want. And really, I just finished, these two twins are 2.5 years old, and they looked at their iPad for the whole 10 sessions. And then it just makes it very easy. You also have to get the kids' agreement. So I seldom ever work on kids I haven't worked with their parents. So the parents know what I'm doing. And their parents have had some experience of having a massage themselves. So if you're a parent and you've never had a massage, I would recommend before you try to massage your child, go get a massage from somebody so you have some idea of what the experience is that you're trying to translate to your child. Does that make any sense?
No, it makes total sense, and it makes me think, like you said, if there's a reluctance or they haven't gotten it done, let's just say 30% of the women that you've encountered, you can easily double or triple that from the male's perspective. So, what approaches have you done to get the outreach out to the fathers?
Well, my book has just gotten published about 2 weeks ago. I've just started sending it out. Okay. I'm going to go back to my office in a little bit and send out another 40 copies to different people. And after the first of the year, I'm going to be following up. And you may have heard the expression, putting the pedal to the metal. That's just what I'm going to go everywhere I can. But see, here's the problem. I'm pretty clear that there's a lot of people that are the head of early childhood development programs that have never had a massage. So they don't tie intelligence, early childhood, cognitive development with massage. But tension affects the way you think. And a lack of tension empowers how you think. I'm Rolfing this little kid now. He's about 12 years old. And he was beat up pretty much by his sister for the first couple years of his life because she had a disorder and she was at home. And he's a pretty traumatized kid. And when he's now about 12, and I met him, and sweetest kid you ever want to meet, but has virtually no self-expression and a very limited vocabulary. So what I'm doing, I've never done this before, but what I'm doing with every one of his Rolfing sessions, he has to come back with 5 new words. And every time he does, and he starts telling me the words, you can see this little beam of light coming over this kid's whole body. So there's ways that you can, we will have a link on our website, handsonparenting.org, that gives people access to early learning tools. And you can download them, you can use them as flashcards, and you can incorporate them in your massage. And so you could do things like print out flashcards that teach your kid parts of their body, like thumb and finger and hand and arm. And when you make a connection, but when you see it and you say it and you experience it, then it becomes knowledge, not just memory. So there's lots of things that people can do they aren't doing. How do I know they're not doing it? In Philadelphia alone, there are 400 elementary schools. In those 400 elementary schools, 7 out of 10 children cannot read, write, or do math proficiently. Now, is that the school's fault? Partially. But that problem started at home, and that's where it needs to end. And it's just as simple as massaging your kid's hand and counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fingers. And then counting the other hand, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then counting the toes, 15, 20, and you've taught a kid multiplication, you've taught them addition, and you've begun to teach them numbers. But it's all a function of talking to your children like they're intelligent. And the more you do that, the smarter they'll get.
Speaking of 2018, Robert, and pedal to the metal, I was just thinking about partnerships. And so some places, like if I want to go to a chiropractor, they may cover insurance, and then they may have a massage therapist in their office. So after they've gotten structured or, had their chiropractic session, they usually get positioned to the massage therapist. Have you thought about partnering with that community to spread the word about Rolfing?
I haven't. I'm going to be honest with you. I haven't gotten that far yet. For the last 20 years, I've devoted at least half of my time and energy to collecting, repairing, and distributing low-cost refurbished computers to people that can't afford to buy new ones. And someone might say, well, why do you do that? And I say, well, everybody that gets a computer from me has to write a letter. And if you know how to read a letter and you know how to read between the lines, they tell you about the stress and tension in their lives because they don't have a computer or they don't have computers at home. They can't get their homework done. They're failing. They can't communicate with their schools. The parents can't find social services on blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I'm a big advocate for, as I said, early childhood development, and my son could, by the time he was 2.5, turn a computer on, teach himself whatever he wanted to learn. He knew how to use a keyboard, knew all the letters, could. Now, I did videotape this for those who are listening and don't believe that. It is possible. And he did know the keyboard. He played Reader Rabbit, Math Rabbit, Language Express. I bought every learning company program you could imagine. And I made sure that I associated learning with fun and not pressuring him. And he took on learning and having fun. He's now 30, or he'll be 30 tomorrow. And so I've been wrapped up in this computer project for the last 20 years. I run this big 8,000 square foot warehouse. It's underfunded, understaffed, and has taken a fair amount of my time and energy. And now that I've got the book out, I'm beginning to refocus what I want to do with my life. One of the things I want to do is to keep the computer project going because I think we're providing a critical resource to the community. And I think it's a shame that there are so few people like me around the country doing this. We haven't even begun to address the digital divide in this country. Forget about broadband and all that other stuff. Just having devices in people's homes, it's ridiculous. A woman came to me yesterday, got a computer. She said she works in a daycare center, and they have no computers. So we also have early learning software that we're going to make available on our website, handsonparenting.org. So the question about I've thought about partnering with everybody in the world, but so far I'm a little bit further out than you should say. You could say most average Rolfers, most average massage therapists, most early childhood educators. So I learned in Vietnam how to be a point man, how to go first, how to clear out the jungle. And so I'm working on clearing out the morass of humanity to making room for some more intelligence, more love, more peace, more power. And next year, I have no idea where I'm going to go, who I'm going to see, but I'm going to go everywhere I can and see everybody I can and everybody that I can get this book in front of. That's what I'm interested in doing. So if there's anybody listening and they want more information, they can feel free to contact me on my website.
No, that's great. Looking at handsonparenting.org and under your Learn More tab, you do have videos, so it'll be really interesting to kind of check back in periodically to see all the latest new videos that you upload so people can get more educated about what you have to offer.
I'm holding my breath today. There's a family that I work with, and I Rolfed the mother and father, their parents, 4 of their children when they were babies. They all grew up and had babies and children. Their daughter is becoming a nurse at NYU. Their youngest son loves being Rolfed. His wife got Rolfed. She had her advanced sessions, and the 2 or 3 days after the baby was born, before they had the bris, he asked me to come over and Rolf the baby. So that baby has now had 14 sessions. His wife's having another baby sometime this week or next week, and I'm sure that as soon as they have the baby, they're going to call me up and say, come over and let's Rolf that baby. So that's 4 generations of families that I've touched just in that one family. And there's other ones. So I'm a big fan of getting to as many people as deeply as you can. And those videos will actually go up. Some of them, if people just Google my name on YouTube, Robert Toporek on YouTube, they can find a ton of videos on Rolfing babies and children.
Oh, perfect.
Mm-hmm. Robert, how long is typically a session, a Rolfing session with a child as opposed to an adult, or is it the same amount of time?
Now, newborn babies take 15 to 20 minutes at the most. A toddler takes about a half an hour, maybe 35 minutes, 40 minutes at the most. Adults usually take 45 minutes to an hour. I just finished 2 little boys. They were twin boys. They were 2.5 years old. I'm working on 2 African-American twins. I started them when they were 6 days old. So it all depends. I just finished Rolfing like 7 or 8 people, and every one of them, the results were just ridiculously. And I think I'm getting, the more I practice, the better I get. I finished a woman yesterday, and I was just astounded. Not yesterday, Friday. And I videotape and photograph everybody before and after. Because if you just went around the planet one day and videotape people, like take 100 people, and you say, tell me about yourself, your body, your life, and then you went back a year later, their stories may not have changed. But everybody will have had a story. By the time I finish Rolfing somebody, by the time those 10 sessions are over, their stories have totally changed. Like this woman, she said, I'm getting older, I'm full of aches and pains, I don't want to get up, I don't want to go anywhere, I don't want to do anything. And at session 10, I was like, I don't know, I just feel great. Nothing hurts, I've got a lot of energy, and I feel happy. So, and that shows up in the video interview. So I don't know that there's very many people on the planet that have as extensively videotaped and photographed people's personal transformation through having their bodies worked on. And see, when you go, when you go get a massage, you don't usually go for a series of sessions, and it doesn't usually have a beginning and an end to it. Now, I haven't studied all the massage programs in the world. I'm sure there are some that are like that, but I know that the way Dr. Rolf set up Rolfing was that it is that way, and there's specific things that get worked on in every session, and I use that model in the book Hands-On Parenting, so each chapter deals with a different part of the body and how that part of the body relates to some area of life. For instance, your chest and shoulders have to do with holding things in or letting things go. So when you open up, you literally sit up straighter. When you're holding things in, you're usually crouched over. And one of the things I noticed is that parents love to give their children everything they can, but have no concern whatsoever for their posture. Their posture either in their body or their posture in their life. So I'm hoping that this book begins to change that, and that we begin to look at kids from a holistic perspective instead of just their brains or just their talent or blah, blah, blah. And I've now been doing this long enough that I have actually some long-term documentation on some kids that I've brought. 2 of them were twin girls. Both of them became state champion gymnasts. They grew up, they went to Temple University, they both studied film, and they're both working in the film industry. And from time to time, they come and do videotapes for me. It's pretty cool, isn't it?
Yeah.
I didn't know those babies. I didn't know those babies would turn out like that. Oh, and they both want their boyfriends to get Rolfed, and neither one of them are able to convince their boyfriends yet to do that.
What about the other side for the type A folks that you want to get them from first learning about Rolfing to ultimately doing the 10 sessions? Is it a possibility to combine sessions?
No. I mean, you could, but I don't.
Okay. Any particular reason?
I'm just a religious Rolfer, and Dr. Rolf would probably stab me in the back if I was trying to do that.
Do you have any experiences working with autistic children, Robert?
I have. Actually, not autism per se, but kids in the Asperger's syndrome. I was working on this one kid. I actually have to call him up and see what happens. He disappeared after session 8. He was volunteering on a regular basis, and I haven't seen him in a while, and I haven't had the wherewithal to call him, but I'll finish him. It was making a big difference. And I'm working on this kid now who's 30. He's in the Asperger's syndrome. He was hospitalized for depression, and he's a diabetic. And the best job he ever had was just working in a store as a shelving clerk. And he didn't have a job, and he wanted to get in the world of computers, so he came and started volunteering with me. And his ability to think, if you tell him what to do, he'll do it. After he's done that, he can't look around and see what's wanted and needed. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I'm beginning to train him to be able to look around and see what's wanted and needed and do what's wanted and needed instead of just what we tell him to do.
Interesting.
And there's another kid that works with me. He's in the Asperger's syndrome and does not want me to touch him. And this is what I want to say. There's more than one way to touch a person other than putting your hands on them. So you could use touch as a metaphor for how to have an impact on someone. So what I've done with this guy, I had a technology director, and we parted ways a number of months ago. And this guy, Matt, he would say, Matt's having a good day, Matt's having a bad day, blah, blah, blah. But I had a conversation with Matt. I said, Matt, it's going to be time to step up the game we're playing. Are you interested in my coaching, even though you're not interested in my specifically Rolfing you? So I used the distinctions of self-expression, taking a stand, moving in a new direction, having more vitality. And he's been picking up on that. And both him and this other kid are helping me run my nonprofit organization for the last couple of months. Miraculous. Mm-hmm. There's a young woman with Down syndrome. She was profoundly Down syndrome. And this is about 23 years ago. I Rolfed her. I met her mother at a program in Chestnut Hill that works with kids with developmental challenges. And I said, hey, if you want to have exponential results with your daughter, you'll have her get Rolfed and do another program that I know about called Landmark Education. So they happened to be wealthy enough to be able to afford that. The mother got Rolfed, the father got Rolfed, the grandparents got Rolfed, the kid got Rolfed. They did all these other programs that I recommended. And then after about 2 years, they left town, went to Florida. I lost touch with them. I called them up a couple of years ago. So glad you called us. And when she left with a possibility that her daughter was going to go to Harvard. So when I called her, I had a little trepidation because I didn't know how it turned out. And I said, how's Lauren? She said, well, so glad you called. She didn't graduate Harvard, but she is graduating a small college here in Palm Beach, a little Christian college. Her major is theater and dance. I said, no way. And she did. And now she lives in Ohio. She's married. She drives a car, and she started her own company called Baskets of Love or something like that. So my whole point in mostly everything I've done up until now is to get to the point where I can get my hands on babies in incubators newborn babies that are having a critical time in life, that's where ultimately I think I can make the best difference. And I think it takes a certain kind of touch and knowledge that, as best I can tell, doesn't particularly exist on the planet at the moment. Because, as best I can tell, it's not a widespread idea. However, every children's hospital in the United States will get a copy of my book. And we'll take it from there. And you guys will say a prayer and wish me luck.
Oh, absolutely. And you did mention, there's a ton of benefits from your examples. You've talked about some changes in social development, changing their poise, their posture, and that's been fantastic. Are there any downsides or any disadvantages to massage to children or younger babies?
I haven't found one, nor can I imagine one. Now, somebody might argue with that, but if they have as much experience working with babies and children as I do, I'd be more than happy to have that conversation with them. But I haven't found any downside to it. Children are just starving to be touched, to be loved, to be appreciated, and to be acknowledged. That's what I found.
Yeah.
I don't care how much money they have or how little money they have. All they want to do is be known. I had a bunch of kids in my office yesterday from low-income families, 3 kids that were taken out of foster care, and a woman is raising them herself. And they're just the cutest kids you ever wanted to meet.
Now, did you also mention that you steer some of your patients to Landmark Education? Are you a part of Landmark?
Being a part of it isn't exactly the right word because there's no such thing as being a part of it. I've been Dr. Rolf. It used to be called the Earhart Seminar Training, and Dr. Rolf took that training, and Werner Earhart got Rolf. Werner started recommending Rolfing to everybody that he was training. Dr. Rolf started recommending the Landmark Forum or the S training to everybody she was training. And most of the people in her in that circle at the time actually did that. With me, when I took her class, it was a requirement before I went any further that I stay in Santa Monica and take the S training. I didn't want to do it. I didn't think I needed it. I thought they were crazy. And I took it, the reason I took it was to demonstrate that it didn't work. I didn't need it. I was right in the first place. And that didn't work out too well because I was sitting there the first morning with my arms crossed, looking around the room, judging and evaluating everybody in the room. And the guy who was leading the course, there was a woman that kept jumping up and down and arguing with him. And he said, I just remember this really clearly, he said, "Lady, why don't you just sit down, unfold your arms, and see what's possible?" So I looked at her and I said, wow, I don't know anybody here. Nobody knows whether I'm going to get anything out of it or not. I don't have to say anything. Let's see what's possible. And from that moment on, you could say that my life transformed. Had I not, and then Dr. Rolf's son came out to California, more or less rescued me, invited me to come to his house in New Jersey, spend 3 months studying with him, which I did. And during that period of time, I found out that his mother lived in Blackwood, New Jersey, which was not very far away, and that she was always asking him to do this and do that and blah, 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 and go here and go there. I said, "Dick, I'll take all that off your plate." She said, "Fine. She's coming in about a week or so. Go pick her up at the airport." So I did, and I said, "Hi, Dr. Rolf, remember me?" And she kind of gave me that look she has. And I said, "I got good news for you. I'm going to be your East Coast business manager." She said, "Is that so? Do you have $5 to get my bag?" So because I had $5 to get her bag, and on the way home, she said, "By the way, Bob," she called me Bob, "I need a secretary." And she had one the next day. And for the next 4 years, I was her East Coast business manager. I traveled around with her. I went places, did things, set up her final classes. The last year of her life, she was in my house almost every day. And had I not completed all my anger at my mother and my parents and my past, and I could have never had the kind of relationship with her that I did, which is pretty different than what most Rolfers talk about, how tough she was and how. We didn't have that kind of relationship. We just had a, like, hey, you're the master, I'm the student, what do you need? And then and then I came back to Philadelphia, and I ended up Rolfing Werner Erhardt's parents, and I've Rolfed a bunch of the leaders of Landmark Education and lots of participants. I've had lots of people that I've Rolfed take the Landmark Forum, so I'm a big advocate of that. I'm a big advocate for whatever makes a difference, whatever rocks your boat, that's what you should do.
No, that's good feedback. I never connected the two with the Rolfing and the Landmark Forum.
I didn't either, as precisely, but I did in the book. And I had a book coach who asked me a question. He said, "Who's the first kid you ever Rolfed?" I thought about it. It was Dr. Rolf's grandson. So her son Dick felt he was too emotionally tied to his children. They were like 12 or 13 at the time, and he didn't have the space to work on them the way he wanted to, so he asked me to. So I Rolfed that kid all the way through 10 sessions. I did some work on the other kids. I've done some work on her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren.
One thing I like about your site is that for people that are so new to this, I mean, you're talking about Rolfing, you're talking about all the benefits, and you're talking about the benefits of child and baby massage. And on your site, you're promoting your book, but you give out the first chapter so people can learn more about that. We're almost at the top of the hour, so I do want to give you some time to talk about your book on Amazon and your sites and your general promotion if you'd like to right now.
Well, it's a great book. You can purchase the ebook either through Amazon or through my site. We're going to start creating blogs. There's a free first chapter. Just that first chapter alone can transform how somebody thinks about raising their babies or children. And we're going to add, as I said, I only got the book published a couple of weeks ago. I got my website, the second part, done last week. I'm not done putting everything up there I want to. I recently published an article on Rolfing babies, children, and families that was published in the Rolf Institute's journal, and it's going to go up on that site. I love the book. I love the idea that it can make a difference. I love the idea of being able to get it to every parent, in every parent's hands, and them using their hands to create a new way of relating to their children. I was with someone for Thanksgiving, and I couldn't figure out when I came back. People said, "How was Thanksgiving?" And I said, on a scale of 1 to 10, it was a 5. But it was really worse than that. And there was no love in that family that I was with that day, except for one woman that I know. And I just really realized that how important it is. Love is just a magical thing. You know, we hear all the songs about the magic of love. And touch is a great way. You just hold somebody's hand, give them a hug, pat them on the back, do something physical with your child, and it will make a difference in how they grow up, how they relate to you, how they respect you, and how you respect them. I have that relationship with my son. He's 30 years old. I asked him what he wanted for his birthday, and he said nothing. And I said, "When you were growing up, I gave you everything I could, didn't I?" He said, "You did." And it doesn't matter if you have a lot of money, as long as you can give your kid everything you got, everything of you that you can give them is what will make a difference in how you relate to or raise your babies or children.
Well said, well said. Again, you have been in tune to another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. We had the honor of interviewing Robert Toporek, who is the author of Hands-On Parenting, a practical guide to massage for healthier, happier, smarter kids. With that, I am Hamza.
And I am David.
And we thank you for your time, Robert. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It was a great interview, and I appreciate you giving me the time.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Go Eagles.
Have a good holiday.
Thank you, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again for checking out another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast. Please check us out on our website at intrinsicmotivation.life, where you can click on the Speak Pipe button and leave any suggestions for future podcasts that you'd like us to cover. Also, check us out on our social media sites. We have a YouTube channel, Facebook page, iTunes podcast, in addition to Stitcher and Google Play, all under Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. Check you out next time. Have a great day.